you guys, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we are looking at how to get the drum sound you hear in Time to Pretend by MGMT.
The drummer is Andrew Van Wingarden. The producer was Dave Fridman. It sounds like a super blown out version of Dancing Queen. We have no idea how they did it. We're gonna figure it out.
For our drums today, we used a Ludwig Vistalite kick drum, and it has no front head, and we stuffed it with a sleeping bag. For our snare, we have a Jimmy Chamberlin Yamaha snare drum with a lot of dampening products on top, including a Big Fat snare drum. And we also used Zildjian K-Suite hi-hats. So the groove of this song was inspired by the beat in Dancing Queen by ABBA. So you want to get that real tight disco beat feel. Additionally, we heard what sounded like an overdubbed hi-hat pattern. So to get that 16th note groove and make it sound like the drum machine sound we were hearing, I choked up on the sticks a little bit and played with the tip toward the bell of the hi-hat to give it that electronic sound.
So for MGMT, this sound is incredibly complex, right? When you listen to the drums here, there's so much going on. And this is kind of going on in like most of Dave Fridman's drum sounds, which is there's tons of distortion. There's also lots of weird stereoizing situations that don't feel totally one for one, meaning like you can't quite pick out, oh, it's this microphone doing this thing or this microphone doing this thing. The way that tends to happen is through these complex mazes of processing, right? A snare drum gets sent to these three things, crunched up, then sent to this, right? It all kind of then gets mashed together and distorted together. The result is something that has so much character and so much texture, but it's really hard to pick out. So when we set out to recreate this today, there's no information online about it. The best that we can do is start latching on to little individual attributes that give us some kind of clue into what's going on. So the first question that we're asking when we're hearing this drum sound is, was it recorded in stereo or was it recorded in mono? There's aspects of this that feel like they're recorded in stereo. There are aspects that feel like they're recorded in mono. It certainly does not have a natural stereo field of drum sound, right? Meaning that it does not have the stereo spread that you would have when you sit behind a drum kit like a lot of modern recordings do. The cymbals at moments are wide. The toms throughout the song are very wide. The snare drum has a width to it most of the time, but sometimes it's very mono. And the hi-hat is very, very centered. Now, what that tells me is that there was in fact stereo overheads, right? Because the cymbals end up wide. However, there was some kind of mono microphone that was getting a lot of hi-hat, and that is that's not just a secondary part of this drum sound, that's a big part of this drum sound. So much so that even though there is some stereo width to the hi-hat, it feels very mono because that microphone that has a bunch of hi-hat is so prevalent. For the snare drum, we knew that there was some abnormal width going on in some way, that it wasn't just a one-for-one microphone. There was some trickery going on. So let's listen to the individual mics and kind of figure that part out. So lots of times when you're recording a drum kit, you'll start with the overheads or you'll start with the kick drum. On this recording, I started with a mono 421. I stuck it equidistant from the kick drum, the snare drum, and the hi-hat. And I crunched it up by taking it through a Telefunken preamp, out of the output of that and into another Telefunken preamp into the input, right? So it caused a lot more distortion than would normally happen. I started with this because I knew that this was gonna be like the entire heart and soul of this drum sound. It's all of the character of this drum sound exists just in this mic. If you take it away, it has no character. If you put it in, that's the whole drum sound. You could just use this mic if you wanted to, but everything else is just there to reinforce this sound. So the kick drum is just to reinforce that mono mic. We stuck 2 mics on it, the AKG D12, which is a really, really well-balanced vintage microphone, right? It's not too clicky, it's not too high-endy, it's not too big in the low end, which we knew that we didn't really need a ton of because we had our kick-out mic. That is a FET 47, and we are using that just for all of the body and the length of this kick drum. So for the snare drum, the width of the snare drum was really unnatural on this. There's a couple clues as to why it was not just a normal snare drum recording. Width from a snare drum, it can only come from a few different places. Snare drums, if you just stick a mic on a snare drum, it's not gonna have width, right? The width of the snare drum comes either from the overhead mics, right, which are wide, so they have this extra differences between the 2 microphones, or it comes from room mics, which, you know, the left side of the room sounds very different from the right side of the room, so there's all this width that comes from that. However, we knew that they weren't using room mics because you didn't really hear them, right? And we knew that they weren't using their overheads that much because the cymbals were not that wide. The hi-hat was really, really centered. And so it means that some kind of trick is going on. What we ended up doing to make the width on this snare drum was we took our regular snare drum recording, which was super basic. We had a Beyer 201 on top, very similar to a 57. It's like a little bit more well balanced. On the bottom, we had an AKG 414. The bottom mic was not really doing much. It's mostly the top. And then that sound, in parallel, we gated it and put a delay on it, right? This was a ping pong delay, and it was at 6 milliseconds and with no feedback, meaning that it, on the left side, it would do 6 millisecond delay. On the right side, it would do a 12 millisecond delay. Now, normally, that's a kind of a dangerous thing to do on a snare drum because you have all kinds of phase relationships that you have to deal with, right? When you delay something only by that many milliseconds and you're using the original recording as well, there's a bunch of phasiness that can happen. To counteract that, we took that entire signal, this widened stereo snare, and we ran it through an Ashley graphic EQ. Now this is a EQ that is not meant to be used for distortion. However, it is a kind of a crappy EQ and it sounds really interesting when you turn things up too loud into them, and when you crank all of the bands up loud, it starts to get really, really distorted. This was crucial not only to bring out the tone of that snare drum, right, to bring out fatness and to add all this harmonic information to it. It was also crucial because the phasiness of that delayed snare drum, it gets counteracted by the distortion. Phasiness comes when you have 2 similar signals and they are a little bit off from each other, so they start to subtract at certain times. And because the signal is so distorted, The most distorted part of it is the transient, the very moment of impact. And that moment is also the moment where you get all these phase interactions really messing things up. That moment just gets completely obliterated. It's almost unrecognizable to what you put in. It does not resemble what comes out of it. And thus, all of a sudden, you don't have to deal with these phase interactions too much. So because the Ashley squashes everything so flat dynamically, we then wanted to add a little bit of dynamics back into that snare drum sound, and we did that with a pair of distressors. We had the attack time set really, really slow. We had the release time set really, really fast, and the result is you get a little extra bump back into your super distorted snare drum sound to just give it that extra snap. So to round out the sound, we added stereo overheads. This was largely just to get a little bit of brightness back into it. And also at the moments where we wanted to have stereoized cymbals, we could pull that out. For this, we used a pair of the Bill Bradley C12 clones. They're super well balanced and just generally great sounding overhead mics. And then finally, we did some processing on the entire kit together. We have everything running through a Soundtoys decapitator. That's just adding some general distortion. We have it running through a PSP vintage warmer. That's just giving it a little bit more character and maybe a little bit of compression. And we have it running through a Waves Trans X, which just gives it a little bit extra punch. It's a transient designer type of thing, but it's multi-band and it just gives a little bit of extra punchiness to the overall sound. That was Time to Pretend by MGMT.
Thank you so much for watching, and as always, please let us know in the comments what other songs you would like to hear, and we will see you next time.